Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another episode of Prudent Observations. I am your host, the Prudentialist. You can also call me Matt. So welcome to another little corner of the world of the internet, talking about international relations and geopolitics. And I am joined today by one of my favorite regular co-hosts and guests, Mr. Furius Pertinax of the Pasta Posse. How are you, good sir?
Indeed. Good morning. Speaking of the corner of the world, I am actually in the corner of the world, the bottom corner. No, but wonderful to be back. As you say, we do get on very well, and I do love your channel, and it's one of my favorite subjects. It's sort of when we talk about contemporaneous issues, it is a break from history. Although I love my history, of course. Geopolitics and the modern balance of power is always an intriguing subject, and it's something that evolves, on a week to week, month to month, year to year basis. So it's definitely a favorite topic of mine. So thank you for having me on.
Yeah, I didn't know when we were prepping for this and I asked you to come on, I didn't know that you had actually studied Japanese for a little bit and that you would know quite a bit about the country during your studies. So I thought that would it all kind of worked out, didn't it?
It did in the end. It was a happy accident, you might say. And I never sort of thought that because I think I mentioned these two sort of beforehand, a couple of days ago. It's like, AM and I have been actually planning a at least a mini series sort of on the warring states of Japan, the feudal Japan period, and the Tokugawa shogunate, and leading to the Meiji Restoration, and so it's nice for that some of those old studies to come back to being somewhat relevant. So, and Japan is actually a country I do like. I do like the culture of Japan, and obviously they're interesting people in their own right.
Yeah, well, actually, I think the Meiji Restoration is sort of a good starting point to talk about here. So, the sort of title for today's stream is a bit of a misnomer in the same way that people think that post World War II Japan has this sort of pacifist stance of things, but so during the Meiji Restoration and later sort of the Meiji governmental period of a more liberalized Japanese empire, we had seen that there was a tradition of a no explicitly written constitution, very similar to the English, that there wasn't something officially written down. After the Second World War and the American occupation of Japan, we have a constitution that is written down and imposed as of May 3rd, 1947. There are three individuals that are relatively behind it, but there are two that I kind of want to give substantial focus on. The first one being, of course, Lieutenant Colonel Milo E. Rowell, who was serving as an American military officer during the Second World War, but also had a law degree. And he had spent most of his time drafting this new Japanese constitution for the post-war Imperial Japan. And in fact, most of his drafts are what many Japanese legal scholars rely on to help interpret constitutional issues. The one thing that, of course, I found to be the most interesting and kind of the most bizarre that I think... I wonder, Furious, if you knew about this in regarding to some of the people that played a role in drafting it, was Beat Sorota Gordon, who was the daughter of a rather well-known Ukrainian Jewish piano player who had only been naturalized in the United States at the end of her time of the Second World War in 1945. She lived up until 2012, Austrian-born American performing arts presenter and women's rights advocate. But she was one of the few people to work with Douglas MacArthur to write the new Constitution. She got her degree in Mills College, got naturalized in 45. But she is the explicit reason for Article 24 in the Japanese Constitution that marriage shall be based on mutual consent of both sexes, and it shall be maintained through mutual cooperation with equal rights of husband and wife as a basis. I just thought that was a little interesting tidbit right off the bat there to get to start us all off in regards to the Japanese Constitution. Look at that. But the one thing that I kind of wanted to go on a riff about before we get started on the actual subject matter was the concept of extraterritoriality. Some of you may have heard this before in your political science or legal studies, but Extraterritoriality, as explained by one of my college professors, who ironically was a child during the Second World War in Japan. He immigrated to the United States afterwards and got his PhD in history while he was desperately trying to go to law school. And God bless him. But he had explained extraterritoriality as sort of this colonial concept in which territory outside of the respective nation state is then implemented upon the laws, status, and nations of a particular people. And an instance that feels very much similar to what we have been talking about in a lot of regards to American foreign policy, the sort of uprooting and implementation of the laws of the sort of dominant power that takes place. But to sort of transition here, one explicit thing about the Japanese constitution that also exists, where we get this sort of, misplaced idea of what the Japanese is a pacifist state in post-World War II. Japan maintains the Japanese Self-Defense Forces. It is a de facto defensive army, strictly offensive weapons, which I find to be a misnomer. And most people who work with military weaponry or intelligence will tell you that offensive weapons are kind of a misnomer. But they usually keep away from things like ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons being prohibited. Now, Article 9 itself in the text, which is, I'll read from the official English translation. Article 9, Section 1, aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order, the Japanese people will forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and under the threat or use of force as a means of settling international disputes. Section 2, in order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as all other war potential, will never be sustained. The right of the belligerency of the state will not be recognized. So they sort of maintain an explicit position of not fighting in a given conflict or will not participate in war in such cases. Although the United States and the Japanese Self-Defense Forces have a rather strong relationship, both by the American presence inside of Japan, but they also get substantial teaching, logistics, and intelligence from the United States military. But before I go rambling on any further, Mr. Furious, do you have anything that you wanted to add in or chime in with?
Yeah, well, two small points if I may. I do find it, given the activities of the United States of America in a foreign policy perspective after the war, I do find it sort of interesting that such conditions would be imposed upon Japan, after World War II, given the sort of this military adventurism which would sort of follow the USA thereafter, and sort of with the Americans and I suppose what we'd call the genesis of NATO taking this posture against the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, essentially leading to the premature rearmament of, say, West Germany, and this sort of creation of a standoff alliance against, that sort of Soviet Warsaw Pact entity, which would arise in Eastern Europe, and I suppose that would become a Euro-Asiatic alliance, which sort of NATO and the Americans would stand up against. Inversely, too, I don't know if you know this, but do you know, since the end of well, not since the end of World War II, so it's not really the right thing to say, but since the re-establishment of Japan's military after World War II, are you aware of, or at least I know this to my knowledge, but do you know of the most recent or the first time that the Japanese armed forces actually were sent beyond Japan? Do you know that that's actually occurred in the meantime?
No, I didn't. Not off the top of my head. I couldn't recall.
So there's a little tidbit where I believe it was a unit of Japanese military engineers and like a medical corps were sent to Iraq under the sort of, the coalition of the willing. And I know this only because obviously they're not permitted to send actual soldiers per se. They were guarded by the Australians in Iraq.
Huh. I
So
know that they have a counter-terrorist organization that
yeah,
was passed as an anti-terror law after 9/11. Theirs was a little
mm,
less strict than, say, the USA Patriot Act, but it
mm,
allowed them to use anti-terrorism efforts to contribute to
mm,
international stuff. But I didn't know that they were actually
yeah.
deployed.
So these military engineers and this medical corps, you might say the fact that they were actually deployed and sent overseas caused quite a ruckus, because this would have been just after I think I'd left high school. It would have been sort of like the late 2000s, like 12 or 15 or so years ago, and it caused a ruffling of feathers. It would have been obviously more contentious if they were active military units, like actual fighting brigades or battalions or whatever, but it still caused a bit of a ruckus because it was the first time that Article 9 was sort of pushed to its limits, so to speak. The fact that these Japanese units, although non-fighting in nature, was still sent overseas and still fighting along with the coalition of the willing. It was actually quite the it wasn't a huge controversy, but it was a small controversy, you might say.
Well, we should probably set the table for another reason why for this discussion, and it comes primarily for three reasons and what has played a major role. Firstly, I don't think we can even talk about the concept of Japan moving its posture to a more militant one. If we couldn't talk about that without regarding the tenure of the late Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, who had been recently assassinated last year. It feels so much longer ago than it actually was. But he had spent quite a bit of time. I remember while I was in high school, so this is like 2011. I remember reading an article in Foreign Affairs that said that they had felt concerned under the Obama administration that they didn't feel that they were getting enough attention from the United States and sort of its position for defense and alliances. And that had led a lot for Shinzo Abe during his tenure, both as the president of the Liberal Democratic Party, which has been the primary ruling political institution inside of Japan. It has been really since the end of the war. They kind of enjoy a very similar political monopoly in the same way that for the longest time the PRI did in Mexico. And there's sort of an awkward relationship with organized crime as well that deserves a whole other stream, maybe Apostolic Majesty, and you guys will cover that one day in the future. But wonderful. But yeah, so from 2012 to September 16th, 2020, which I really do think he was kind of forced to step down due to coup-related reasons, but that's another discussion. One of the things that he had done in sort of starting off this discussion about the reforming of the Japanese self-defense forces, that he wanted to revise Article 9 of the Constitution of the Japanese Article 9, which regards to its right of belligerency. And he didn't get a lot of headway in regards to the Liberal Democratic Party, pushing forward with that. Instead of using the Article 96 of the Japanese Constitution, which is its constitutional amendment process, similar to how the United States has Article 5, in 2014, during his tenure, rather than amending the Constitution, his cabinet approved a reinterpretation which gave more powers to the Japanese self-defense forces, most specifically allowing them to defend other allies in case of war being declared upon them, which of course had caused grave concerns from the People's Republic of China and of course North Korea. Whereas of course the Obama administration had supported this interpretation of the Constitution. This had led, of course, to significant political pushback. However, the LDP, with its de facto status of being a sort of a mono-party state, this was allowing itself to defend allies or strengthen alliances that could potentially affect Japanese positions. Since, of course, Shinzo Abe had stepped down in 2020, the current Prime Minister of Japan, Fumio Kishida, with a long-standing position in sort of foreign policy and foreign affairs. He was a member of the House of Representatives in Japan. He had previously served as the foreign minister from 2012 to 2017, so rather spearheading Shinzo Abe's position on a stronger relation with the United States, a more aggressive foreign policy, tackling concerns in regards to espionage and military spending by other countries, and would later be the Minister of Defense from 2017 to 2020. And he's also just a well-known policy wonk. He was also ahead of the Liberal Democratic Party's Policy Research Council. He's got a part of his childhood in the U.S. He went to school in New York City, and he has been more or less just a big part of the faction boss, in that area of the LDP. And now he's been the Prime Minister of Japan since 2020. And in doing so, he has, for the first time in 9 years, changed the position of geopolitical priorities for the Japanese self-defense forces. So at the end of last year, in December of 2022, they announced around December 16th that they were going to announce a new national security strategy that would not only double the country's military defense budget, breaking alongside, previous LDP caps on defense spending, but it wanted to strengthen its military capabilities in doing so. And for the first time since 2013, the primary threat to Japanese sovereignty and its citizenry had changed from North Korea to China. and had acknowledged that China and Russia are strategic partners. So this language is very much sort of in line with what the American policy in regards to a pivot to Asia has been all about since the Obama administration and onward. The United States, and I like to borrow from Thomas 777 on this one, that the United States is like really good in terms of viewing the geopolitical scale through a particular lens. One, it's very 19th century in the way that it views things, sort of building off of that Mackinder, Speakman, and Brzezinski view, but also that it's, it views things very much like the Cold War. And there's a reason why that kind of language still exists today in American media. And in regards to this report, this change in military policy, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida had said that Japan had reached a turning point in its history, and he had said something. He had said this quote: "In Japan's neighboring countries and regions, there is more obvious shift towards attempts to unilaterally change the status quo by might." And he had said, noting that Japan would take a wide range of measures from military to diplomatic to respond to the change. And that's from the New York Times as of December 16th, 2022. And that really does illustrate some of the big changes that we've seen since then, alongside earlier this month. Japan has visited the Biden administration, which had led not only with President Biden, but Secretary Blinken and Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin. So we're definitely seeing a new role in the Indo-Pacific region, and Japan is definitely taking a much larger part of that and has been flexing quite a bit of its military might in the same time as well.
Yeah, indeed. What's actually interesting is just touching on our friend here, Mr. Kishida, is that he's actually as a part of the LDP party, he in fact belongs to a rather more moderate faction than say even Shinzo Abe. One of the sort of internal groups of the party, the LDP, is the Kochike section of the party, or they call it the Broad Pond Society, which is a faction within the party, and they would consider themselves moderate, even dovish, and have been described as being somewhat weak on the actual social conservatism within the party. So interesting that sort of Kishida is sort of in some ways considered Abe's natural successor, but he's certainly less of, I wouldn't really even call Abe a hardliner, but definitely Abe of the mainstream Japanese politicians was the man who most embodied that, dare I call it, return notion that existed in Japanese politics prior to his assassination. So there's an interesting sort of dimorphism between the two men in that regard.
Absolutely. And I think that this has also been at the pressure and behest of the United States as well in its own geopolitical actions. I think it's important for us, and I'm going to do exactly the same sort of thing that I know Mr. D can't stand, but I feel the need to discuss it, which of course is geography. We cannot discuss geopolitics without literally putting the word geography in there. And so I'm going to pull up just a map of the general Indo-Pacific region. I think that it's just necessary for us to get a very clear picture of what we're talking about.
We must have a thigh maps.
Otherwise, yeah, we must have map autism. It's just an absolute requirement. So this is currently where we're, or sort of the Indo-Pacific region in which we're discussing with here. Being in Australia, Furious, I think that we're kind of aware of just the ongoing background politics, not only of sort of China with regards to real estate purchases, but the awkward balance that, say, powers like the United States has to maintain with the unofficial alliance of democratic states, and I say democratic very loosely, that we call the Quad, which of course is Japan, India, Australia, and the United States. And that's been a major push since 2020 onward to sort of maintain a balance against China. Much of sort of the Trump administration's policy on China regarding trade, freedom of navigation operations, and more has been carried over from the Obama administration to the Trump administration, who doubled down on trade, to which has actually carried over quite well into this administration. There's been sort of no holds bar. And last year, I think that we can remember rather famously, Miss Nancy Pelosi flying into Taiwan, which of course has already put the stakes even higher. And then the war in Ukraine with Russia and more or less the rest of the West sort of backing Ukraine has also put China and Russia in a very close relationship, to where it also puts America's position in here even more tenuous because India is enjoying a close relationship with Russia with regards to oil, armaments, and more.
You might say the fundamental bedrocks of the Quad have been, I wouldn't say fatally so, but have definitely been severely compromised by the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. On the basis that you say, obviously, China and India have far different priorities than, say, the United States and their European allies.
Well, absolutely. And this is also, and these things are important to bring into the backdrop because this really does highlight, I mean, Japan's change in policy and this sort of pushing to up their military, not only in spending, but also the deployment of new technology as well. I mean, in 2020, they had finally deployed Mitsubishi, lithium ion batteries for a new class of submarine, which had been met with a stern condemnation from China. But at the same time, this is in a place where the United States is in a rather tough position because one of the things that you don't do is tell the world that you can't do two things at the same time. And about a month and a half ago, Secretary of State Anthony Blinken had stated that there is going to be a difficult time in supporting Taiwan as well as Ukraine simultaneously with regards to munitions or military support when in this regard. And I thought that'd be to particularly be interesting, especially now as Japan has made its call to increase its defense spending and take a more aggressive posture. Article 9 of the Constitution of Japan has not been amended. It has not been changed. But Shinzo Abe's reinterpretation from his cabinet still stands over with Fumio Kishida taking over that role now. And in turn, in doing so, they've made it very clear that North Korea is no longer the principal threat, despite ongoing ballistic missiles testing and nuclear testing from that country. But their primary concern is the Chinese. So their foreign policy seems to be far more in line with the United States' vision of what to do in the Indo-Pacific rather than their own foreign policy.
That's indeed. And just, I mean, a whole series of streams could be done on this, but just in order to frame this conversation, to frame this geopolitical situation and the tensions between China and Japan, I mean, let's not merely assume the fact that these two fought a very vicious conflict during World War II and leading up to World War II from the sort of early mid-30s onwards. China and Japan have extensive history of confrontation just based upon their proximity themselves in a historical context, even prior to, Chiang Kai-shek's government and even communist China and post-Meiji Japan. These two nations have a lot of history behind them that sort of goes back centuries. And so any arising tensions between them and any, you might say, potentiality for hostility cannot be considered surprising.
No, I mean, there ain't no racism like Asiatic racism. I don't think Americans learn.
It's a variety of its own, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's no Americans don't learn how to be racist until they step out abroad. But right. The other thing that I think is also important in the backdrop is that I think you also had came on to discuss this because it affected your country, Australia, is that we were talking about what this sort of AUKUS agreement would turn into, which had been a rather infamous snubbing of the French for a more Anglo-specific alliance of the United Kingdom, the United States, and Australia, and sort of the transfer and shipment of diesel-powered submarines to the Australian Navy and to bolster its defense and intelligence sharing with regards to what was going on inside the Philippines, South China, and just the Pacific Ocean writ large with regards to Australia and China being the principal problem. And at the same time, right, we're now seeing the strengthened position of policy out of the Japanese. But this is important for us to get our picture here. This isn't even beginning to discuss sort of the disputed islands claims that both China and Japan have long had political disputes over, and some were afraid that they may fight over. I think most famously has been the Senkaku Islands, that great dispute that exists there. We're going to pull up a map as well so we can discuss these claims as well, because that's just a huge, you can't get over all these things play a role in regards to how both Japan and the United States are going to view this conflict or to view their own rivalries inside of Japan. So we're going to share just a map here in regards to, and a lot of these issues emerge out of a variety of things. One, independent nations having historical claims to islands within the East China Sea. And then secondly, the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which tried to formalize and codify internationally exclusive economic zones, as well as where does territorial sovereignty begin on the sea line for nations that have coastal waters. And then, of course, we have, as you can tell here on screen, there's also this wonderful issue about gas fields and where some of these islands are going to be. And as you can tell here, sort of crossover into interpreting differing interpretations of not only their air defense identification zone, which, as you can tell, this goes pretty far for China, in the same way that if we were to take that line and go even further south. So anytime that you hear in the news that like Chinese aircraft had violated, Taiwan's air defense identification zone, Taiwan's ADIZ also extends pretty far into China, close to its borders. So you can always get an idea of what that means in regards to geography. But as you can tell, in a fight over energy, also how close the Americans are in regards to the island of Okinawa. And here we are. So, I mean, we can't escape both historical claims, but also energy and the ongoing policy disputes over China and Japan in regards to long-standing territorial disputes. Regardless of where you stand on that issue, maybe I have like one or two Chinese or Japanese viewers that are going to give me an earful in the chat or in the comments, but this is things that we have to keep in mind in the backdrop of this discussion.
Yeah, indeed. And as always, one of the key roots of the disputes between nations. I mean, it's kind of interesting how this and what's happening in Ukraine, Russia, sort of happening simultaneously. Sort of one is you might say, a matter of military positioning or military disposition between sort of two blocks, and there being a collision point between them. In this case, Donbass with that situation. Whereas here, it's one of there is obviously a military strategic factor, of course. Like you said, the US base in Okinawa, and for the Chinese, I suppose, one must also consider strategic islands as being fundamentally what they've always been in the era of aviation and modern navies, is that they are unsinkable aircraft carriers in a sense. And so these islands are vital for both in that ability to extend a vital economic zone and also to project power. So it cannot be understated, even though these islands seem relatively small and potentially insignificant, and also in an age too of compromised energy guarantees and energy supply for countries. Fighting over a potential gas field is not something to dismiss lightly, and specifically in both cases, because even though China is a large country, China is a country also with a fairly large energy deficit, which is why China has been building nuclear and coal-fired power stations, head over heels for 35 years, because it just cannot meet its own demand. Meanwhile, Japan is a small country, albeit a highly industrialized and a densely populated one. So it too, in a different way, has these requirements for guaranteed energy supply.
Yeah, I mean, this is a big thing that China's been dealing with in regards to how to maintain its own power crises. I mean, South China Morning Post had written in 2022 that, they say that China's long-term challenges remain from how do you maintain its economic production, its population of 1.4 billion people, and of course, extreme weather in regards to flooding, monsoons, and the ability to maintain power when the grid is being strained more than ever. They face a very similar problem that the United States does, at least maybe more so Texas, with its own power grid and its population. So heat waves and drought can mainly affects its hydroelectric power, but at the same time, they're also in their own position of trying to maintain an energy production advantage, primarily coal firing and nuclear power plant investment, while at the same time, on face, right, politically speaking, we know that China, India are some of the largest polluters on Earth. China is one of the few countries in the Asiatic region that would not be considered Western aligned, that has signed on to various international climate accords, which plays its own regards to how it plays in politics here. But we have this map up here, and I can't help but think in regards to Taiwan about the issue of trade, and more specifically also exporting international shipping, because what is the United States Navy really for, other than to help maintain global waterways in regards to trade and international shipping? And I can't help but think of the Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Company in regards to this new posture from the Japanese, because what is one of the things that Japan, Western European nations, the United States has invested heavily in the last 15 years has been the Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Company. And they have been on their way to really push things in a direction that will help them potentially open up plants, not just inside of um, here in the United States, because they've talked about investing in Arizona, but they also want to in regards to Japan. And I think that's going to be a big issue that we have to acknowledge in this regard as well, because, well, the war in Russia and Ukraine, and this is something that blew my mind when I was, very early on at the beginning of the war, was that 50 to 60% of the world's entire semiconductor grade neon, which is necessary for semiconductor manufacturing, is made out of two companies inside of Ukraine, which significantly altered calls and supply sharing for semiconductor production and the strategic necessity to them, which was a big part and parcel for pushing, I believe, the USA Chips Act in the way that it does to punish American companies that want to work with China for semiconductor manufacturing. But it also played a role in how the Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Company is going to get access to that neon. They had said early on when the war began that they have strategic reserves, but their production had led to some cuts in their own spending. They had been facing a cyclical downturn. But I'm going to share this article, and this comes from the Asia Times. I'm just referring to some of the data that's being shared here. So we're going to bring this tab up. That, the Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Company is weighing new plants in Japan and Europe, being the world's leading semiconductor manufacturer. So, like the US, Japan, and the EU have both pursued investments in here, and this is from the 16th of this month here in January. So they said in Japan, they are planning to build a specialty technology fab, semiconductor fabrication plant, which will utilize 12 and 16 nanometer, a 2228 process technologies. Volume production scheduled for late 2024. And it will probably make commercial sense. Japan is short of foundry capacity, and government subsidies will almost certainly be forthcoming, perhaps up to 60% of the value of the fabrication facility, given how much expensive it is to build in Japan compared to Taiwan. And that's just the approximate size of the grant the Japanese government has offered for the specialty technology that Wade mentioned in the call. Called Japan's Advanced Semiconductor Manufacturing is a joint venture between the TSMC, Sony, Toyota affiliate Denso. Its products will reportedly include image sensor data, say for signal processors, automotive ICs, and other logic devices, with a top priority on supply to Sony, Desno, and other customers in Japan. Sony is the world's top maker of image sensors. So I don't know. I don't know how prominent car culture is in Australia. I can't imagine it's as bad as here it is in the United States. But throughout 2022, there was a local car dealership in my area, and they would always talk about when or where the chips were back, as in microchips in regards for car production, because we've basically just made our cars computers these days. And they would just, they'd go out and tell you that the chips are back so they could sell more cars, because it's been a huge issue with supply chains. And go ahead.
Moreover, if I may, just on the subject, just because it's relevant. Indeed, it was true for the automotive industry, because they've really just become a glorified white good nowadays, because they're so computerized, and everything is electronic on cars, and everything from braking and steering is all governed by computers, rather than being sort of manual mechanical operations or hydraulic, as they have been since prior to, say, 5 or 10 years ago. This has also become very much true in the field of, say, machinery operations. So for example, if someone wanted to buy a tractor or a harvester for their farm, again, the backlog predominantly in microchips has actually led to massive backlogs where people have purchased these machines for their farms, or any, this is true also for factories too, but we're obviously speaking about vehicles here. They would buy a tractor or a harvester, and there would be an 18-month waiting list, simply because there was an insufficient quantity of semiconductors or microchips in order to keep up with the demand of production, which had been sort of relatively stable in the preceding in the preceding years.
I was about to ask. I mean, you work in agriculture more than I think anyone in our circles, and has that been a problem for you and your family about getting access to new equipment?
Not strictly speaking, because obviously we have downsized, so for us it's actually been somewhat advantageous. But even for us, because we actually were looking at perhaps acquiring a smaller tractor for our new operation, we just had to wait. We haven't even bothered putting an order because there's just why wait? Well, why put a deposit down and wait 18 months? Like it'll eventually correct itself, but we're not in a position where we actually require it, so we're happy to wait. But I mean, for instance, I know people in our area, our immediate area, who have had standing orders that have exceeded a year, and they do not have firm delivery times on these new machines yet. So, I mean, that there starts to impact other industrial sectors and productive sectors of the economy. You think something like microprocessors, it's just computers, or it's just, it's this thing, specific thing, but that there then has ongoing ramifications that's sort of expressed through other sectors of industry and productivity within an economy. So that's always worth keeping in mind.
Yeah, and I find this little tidbit here. According to the Semiconductor Industry Association report issued in September 2020, depending on the type of fabrication facility, a new fab in the U.S. costs approximately 30% more to build and operate over 10 years than one in Taiwan, South Korea, or Singapore, and 37 to 50% more than one in China. As much as 40 to 70% of that cost differential is directly attributed to government incentives. And that does play a role in regards to how quickly we can get one set up here from the TSMC into Arizona here in the United States. But at the same time, right, the concern also lies in, well, what's America going to do in the meantime? And I think that this shift in policy is indicative of sort of the greater geopolitical stake in there. This is at the same time where Xi Jinping has sort of sacked his rather former, the man who once held his chair. It was rather famous public arrest and taking away when the party Congress had met earlier last year. And then, he sort of secured a role that is sort of a lifetime position, which had been a substantial change since Chairman Mao had been in charge in China. So I think that we're sort of seeing the setup to a much greater long-term play here.
Just very quickly, just because Manoan has said in the chat, Manoan says older farm machinery price went through the roof about 6 months ago due to the chip problem on newer models. That's actually quite correct, and that's also even true for cars. The market for, you might say, either pre-computerized machines and vehicles, or ones that are very simple and are largely still sort of mechanical and hydraulic, be it cars or tractors or anything. There has been a very, very strong secondhand market for these things expressly for that reason. He raises a good point.
I mean, the same thing is true here in the US. Like the price of a used car went up 30% in 2022. So, I mean, this is going from the ongoing chip shortages and the fact that, I mean, COVID as well. I mean, it got so bad in the United States that there was a national run on RVs and other sort of private camping vehicles. And so I like RV homes, places where you could have a trailer park actually grew in the United States just because things had gotten so expensive. And so
we notice that here too, even say for example, you mentioned like camper vans and stuff, because obviously international travel was curtailed for the better part of 18 months or at least a year. Domestic internal travel became actually almost lucrative. Like you say, people, it's like, well, I can't jump on a plane, I can't fly to Europe, I can't fly here, can't fly there. I'll buy a camper van and drive around the countryside. And people did that, quite extensively. Particularly like boomer types are on the cusp of retirement. It's like, well, we can do this. So that's exactly what they did do.
Yeah, I mean, this is the other important thing to keep in mind too is that like semiconductor inventories, they had peaked in regards to the demand, and everyone's trying to salvage their profitability while there's so many people asking for more, and the demand is just at an all-time high. Supply has been low because of this. And go for it.
I just want to say, just to put onto that, to transition to sort of actual computer, strictly speaking, this sort of coincided. I mean, not so much now because for those who do follow crypto markets, they've absolutely sort of the arse has fallen out of them in a very profound way. But sort of through that early part of COVID, like through 2021, basically, and sort of the beginning of 2022, because it was still very high price demand for cryptocurrency, and there's still a shortage of video cards, because obviously with the GPU, that's how people mine. You just couldn't build a computer. If you actually required a computer for business or for whatever purposes it was, that there was even exacerbated because of that, the cryptosphere, just it was so difficult being able to actually build yourself a PC on the basis that there was such a limited supply of computer componentry as well, like in the stricter sense of the word that we might appreciate. Oh, semiconductors, processors, computers. Yeah, so even in terms of computers, if your business required something, well, you're dead out of luck because you just had to wait.
Yeah, I mean, this is at the same time, right, where they're just beginning to invest here in the United States as well. I mean, that last month, TSMC had announced that it wanted to increase its investment in that Arizona facility from 12 billion to
Mm,
40 billion dollars. I mean, this really does
yeah.
illustrate that something that is convenient is not usually resilient. And I think
Yes.
that COVID definitely showed how, the convenience of a global supply chain is not very resilient. And
And one that's wide but shallow, like the whole just in time idea, of like,
oh,
oh,
yeah.
Amazon can post this to you in, 5 days or something. It's like, yeah, okay, but there's like, in the western half of America, there might be only 7 in the inventory at any given time. And then when, 7 are bought in one day because of lockdown, well, then there's just like a 3-month backlog that can't be satisfied in time. That's the nature of it, right? Like it's broad, but it's shallow. And that came to the fore, or certainly has come to the fore in the last couple of years. That isn't
Absolutely.
resilient.
Yeah, and I mean, one can't understate sort of the American influence that plays into this policy, and this does play into Japan's policy as well. This isn't to say that Japan is acting on behest of the United States. Japan is certainly a nation state that does have agency. We can't ever ignore that. But and why are we talking about the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company? Because Japan is just as much as reliant on them as well. Just because the regulatory and the lack of um, real estate by the nature to help build industrial centers also limits this as well. But for instance, Morris Chang, who had helped establish the Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturing company nearly 40 years ago in the 1980s, he had studied at Harvard, MIT, Stanford. He worked for TI, Texas Instruments, for 25 years before going out to do the way that he does. And so this isn't the first time, of course, that we've attempted to have the TSMC work with the United States or our allies. In 1996, we tried having a U.S. fab facility with them, and did not go so well. It was cited mainly due to personnel costs, engineering, and of course cultural differences in the viewing of a work environment. But to sort of segue back to our conversation in regards to Japan, this was in part because we had the Japanese Prime Minister, as today's thumbnail illustrates. They had visited the White House earlier last week, earlier this week. They had visited the United States, and so I'm gonna share my screen one more time, and we're gonna get to a lovely Vox article. I know we're gonna have to deal with legacy media here, folks, but there's important stuff for us to discuss. And I think that Furious and I can do a pretty decent breakdown, because this really does illustrate sort of the standing portion of where things have changed in regards to the geopolitical picture. So yeah, this is from last Sunday, so we're talking about a week ago. And I try to keep things within a week basis when we cover things on Prudent Observations. I very much like Academic Agent's 3-day rule in regards to coverage, because you never know when something gets proven to be false, the situation changes, or it turns into a nothing burger really, really quickly. You can't be so impulsive on the trigger when it comes to rank punditry. But we'll start here with the article. He says, U.S. officials this week affirmed their commitment to Japan's plans for rapidly scaling up defense spending amid rising tensions with China and North Korea after decades of limited investment post-World War II. But despite support from the U.S. and other allies, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida's plans to turn Japan's self-defense force into an army to counter threats from their neighbors will depend on the Japanese willingness to pay for and staff the surge. Japan's new security posture will increase the nation's military budget by 56%, from about 27.47 trillion yen over 5 years to 43 trillion yen. This is an increase of about 215 billion US dollars to 324 billion as of a market close on Friday. Last Friday, meaning the 13th. Historically, Japan has kept their security spending low due to its constitutional amendment to avoid war, but the country does have a defense budget and has maintained a self-defense force since 1954. And he had met with them that Friday on the 13th. So the U.S. is fully, thoroughly, and completely committed to the alliance. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, in a press conference that Wednesday with Japanese Foreign Minister Yoshimasa Hayashi, Austin, and the Japanese Defense Minister Hamada Yasukazu had promised that Japan, under a new security plan, would take on new roles in the Indo-Pacific region and foster an even closer defense cooperation with the United States and our mutual partners, although Blinken did not specify what those new rules would be. Kishida has cited Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a warning of the threat to Japan and other East Asian nations face from an increasingly militarized China, and has also used Ukraine's successes on the battlefield, that's debatable, in gaining support from international partners to explain Japan's latest military posture. Despite this week's fanfare and the commitment of the U.S. and other partners to Japanese military expansion, doubts remain as to whether Kishida can convince the Japanese people to agree to commit both the financial and human capital that this proposed scale-up would require. And I think that that's a really important thing to discuss here, because there is a substantial anti-American, anti-Western attitude with regards to the military in Japan. I was having a back and forth with a gentleman named the Sunflower Society. He has his own magazine and things like that. He's an interesting guy on Telegram. And during his time abroad, he had seen anti-war and sort of anti-US military deployment in regards to Okinawa, which has always been an issue with regards to Japan. That it's quite prominent with the older generations, sort of the same generation that Kishida's from, the baby boomers being born in the 50s and late 40s and 60s, that there's still a prominent anti-militarism position that comes out of sort of that cultural memory of the Second World War.
One might say a cultural scarring.
Indeed.
Having lived through the aftermath of World War II, because, it's funny sort of in our circles, we talk about living in the ashes. Well, the baby boomers quite literally born into the ashes following Japanese defeat in World War II. That should always be considered amongst these issues pertaining to Japan historically.
Yeah, and I mean, while the LDP sort of maintains a rather strong position in regards to its politics, like you had mentioned, Furious, there is internal factions in there, but we would be remiss if we didn't talk about the political opposition that exists inside of Japan. So if I understand it correctly, the Constitutional Democratic Party, the CDP, is sort of the largest opposition party in Japan. They're sort of the more progressive on this issue. And I mean, this ranges from sort of its cultural positions. Many progressives inside Japan sort of share a very similar view with regards to their own history. I know in doing research and preparation for the stream, throughout this week, I had noticed that the question of whether or not you are a militarist plays, of course, the substantial role here. And Uzumi Kenta, the leader of the Constitutional Democratic Party, according to the Diplomat on the 19th, he was facing criticisms from his sort of progressive voter base to his visit to the Nogi Shrine, which is a shrine to commemorate General Nogi Masarusuke of Imperial Japan, who had led to the defeat of the Russian Navy during the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. And, it's a place, how I understood it, was a place to go to for good fortune, and sort of to have their, a ritualistic practice for people to go to and wish for the best based upon victorious ancestors. But, I think it's interesting. I'm reading this article here, and it says, in response, Uzumi noted that although he acknowledged the shrine's complicated legacy, he had no intention of appearing as a militarist. He visited the shrine to pray for the well-being of his country and his family. It feels very similar in a lot of ways to sort of Western progressive politics about problematic figures of historical, years of yore. But of course, that doesn't, remotely sort of serve as an adequate comparison to, say, America's political statues and figures of the Confederacy in regards to Japan's strong position on regards to militarism, not to mention its issues with communism. And of course, here in the West, right, there's that fascination with Mishima, but even then a failed coup and a suicide indicates, sort of the positions that came out of militarism and bringing back that spirit in Japan.
Of course, and also it has to be sort of seen in context too. For those who have a more a liberal progressive mindset, and one that is thus, I dare say, a little bit self-revisionist, is that for Japanese people of that persuasion, it's not just World War II, which is casts a large shadow over them or their worldview, but it's that everything which occurred in Japan following the collapse of the shogunate and the Meiji Restoration, and that sort of projection of the new imperial Japan, these things sort of gathered a momentum and were traveling in a direction that then led to that pre-World War II and World War II situation. So for them, any kind of slanting towards militarism or any sort of any policies or cultural inertia in this direction for them is invariably a hazard for them, which they obviously wish to avoid. Meanwhile, there is the real world where, Japan's neighbors are, particularly obviously in this case China, developing their military capabilities, are increasing their military strength, are spending, a good deal of, expending a good deal of money and resources in this field. And, Japan, simply for the sake of, realpolitik and geopolitical positioning and maintaining spheres of influence, has to keep pace.
Yeah, I mean, this is at the same time the anti-militarism, the Cold War also plays a major factor in here, because there was, despite during a time of a purge in the at the end of the 1940s, and it's political persecution in regards to politics during Imperial Japan. But there is a Japanese Communist Party, while not remotely popular in regards to, say, its positions in the voting turnout and what there. But, for instance, by the time that the Cold War really had came to an end, by the membership had really begun to fall. And I mean, only, several 100,000 people were involved in regards to its politics, but it's had itself play a role in regards to the Liberal Democratic Party using communism as a boogeyman, kind of similar to how we see socialism here in the United States. But they're staunchly anti-militarist, and they had, taken a rather interesting fascination and affinity with the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War, distancing themselves further after the Soviet Union had dissolved. But they had said that they wished to see themselves as more of a democratic socialist stance since the 1990s. However, though, they've also played a role in regards to being the boogeyman for the LDP, as the Communist Party of Japan had been alluding to sort of the abolition of the Japanese self-defense forces if they were to ever win a major electoral victory. But since the LDP had really won in sort of that snap election in 2021, they had managed their victory, and Kishida had stayed on as prime minister, taking the role after Shinzo Abe had stepped down. These cultural things are really going to be at the forefront internally, because you're asking for an increase in manpower, an increase in taxes at a time of great economic uncertainty. I mean, earlier this month, Christine Lagarde of the European Central Bank had tried to soften the blow in regards to the issue of the oncoming recession that's coming our way. She had said that we're going to have a soft recession. It's not going to be nearly as bad as you think, and we'll recover quite quickly. And it makes me just feel like I've heard that before as a young man growing up in 2008, 2009.
Wow, misplaced economic optimism. Where have we come across that before?
I know. Where have we heard that?
I'm sure that it's never occurred in our living memory at all. Never, not once.
Never. We've never experienced something like that before in our lifetime.
No.
What are you possibly talking about? It's just kind of
it's Doge with the spinning hat meme, about being optimistic for the next decade, Yeah.
That's one of my all-time favorites in regards to it's the little Doge with the spinny hat and standing in front of the Twin Towers. I can't wait to grow up in a decade of economic prosperity and optimism. And I feel like it's been that my entire life.
For those of us who are, you might say, like pre-adults who have a living memory of that, like and that Doge embodies all of us, for without doubt.
Yeah. I mean,
anyway.
This does illustrate at the same time, we have seen an increased defense of Japan's military budget throughout the last several years, especially during the tenure of Shinzo Abe, especially even more so after his reinterpretation of the Constitution in 2014. So since Abe had really been in power. So yeah, since from 2014 to 2023, we've seen an increase. And at the same time, in 2023, the Japanese government plans to purchase 8 F-35A Lightning II Joint Strike Fighters and 8 F-35B for multi-role aircraft as part of a much larger ongoing process, because Japan is one of the member nations of the Joint Strike Fighter program that the United States can export it to, as well as continue its own independent development of sixth-generation fighter and military aircraft, but also purchase 500 Tomahawk cruise missiles from the United States and develop its own second strike missile capabilities and ramp up domestic production of missiles, including a hypersonic model. So the race is on and acceleration is going.
And just
So
on just on that
go for
last
it.
point, if I may, because this is probably the first time we've ever seen them, and not just as in, oh, they dropped a Moab on a cave in Afghanistan sort of situation where there's bound to be no countermeasures. But in this latest conflict that we have been witnessing for the better part of a year now, or it will be a year next month, what's been going on there in Donbass and Ukraine, we have actually seen the, if not the tactical utility of them, then definitely in some ways the industrial slash logistical slash sort of operational effectiveness of hypersonic missiles, which the Americans have admitted themselves they've struggled to sort of keep pace with the Russians. They actually didn't know that the Russians had missiles of that capability, which were ready to go. But very much the Russians have proven that yes, not only are they operational, they're actually quite effective, and the countermeasures to put against them basically don't exist at this point. So it's interesting that Japan has actually gone to that point of, well, we need these as well, knowing what's on the horizon for us.
Yeah, I mean, the internal politics of Japan, of course, is going to play a major role in the future here, because again, the question is can you raise the taxes to do this? And I mean, we went from a time where Michael Crichton would write, what was it, The Rising Sun, in regards to sort of this great fear over Japan. Geopolitical writer and founder of strategic forecasting, George Friedman, who is sometimes a laughable character in a lot of ways, but some of the ways that he thinks is interesting. But he had written a book back in the 1990s called The Coming War with Japan, due to Japan's increasing military, well, not its military, but its economic might that could potentially lead to military conflict, because there was sort of a great, I guess, yellow scare, for the lack of a better term, in regards to Japan's economy. But of course, that had came sort of tumbling down. China's public debt to GDP ratio is one of the highest of any G7 countries. There is actually worse than ours, and has been getting worse for the last 20 years, since 1998, and increasing onward. So any further debt could potentially strain the Japanese economy. And this is at a time, like I mentioned earlier, we're on the face of a recession. And we also have internal politics as well, in regards to the issues of, Shinzo Abe's, scandals, and sort of his time being forced out during COVID and its response, at least on international pressure. But at the same time, the issue of Shinzo Abe's assassination also played a huge role last year, with how Kishida is viewed in the eyes of the Japanese people. He's viewed with an incredibly high amount of unpopularity, similar to sort of like late Barack Obama levels, or late George W. Bush eras of unpopularity. And so many are saying, according to that Vox article, that Kishida's tenure is not to last long if another election is to be held in the next year or two.
Which indeed sort of contrasts with the fact that I know Abe had stepped down in 2020, and when he had been set upon and assassinated in that sort of quite terrible incident, out in the open, Abe was riding a relatively strong wave of popularity. Is actually, in fact, sort of, you might say, had experience of a second wind in his political career. So for Kishida to be his sort of successor, so to speak, but to be in the situation where he's unpopular is quite interesting as a dynamic, if you know what I mean. Like, you'd imagine that a successor to a popular person of a similar political orientation would also be popular, but that hasn't been the case with Kishida.
No, but this does really illustrate, I think, one of the long-standing traditions of democracies, is that when things are really bad at home, you go abroad and try and secure a nice diplomatic or a strategic win here. And I think that, given its domestic situation, not to mention the ongoing dispute over sort of Japanese militarism, and sort of what is the Japanese nation in the wake of the Second World War, and decades of being rather both forced, but also by its own policy decisions, to embrace the American sphere of influence, both in the Cold War and now in the global war on terror and its ongoing geopolitical concerns with North Korea and China. One has to wonder, I says, I think Kishida is really taking advantage of a political moment of opportunity, because this is at a point in time where if Blinken is saying things like Japan is going to take on new roles, and it seems that much of the West, and most especially the United States, being the highest contributor to sort of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine in regards to supporting the Ukrainian armed forces and munitions, logistics, intelligence, and just money, billions upon billions of dollars out of the American taxpayer, and money that we really don't have, that you're going to really have to pass the buck to your allies. And this is the first time that the United States is engaging in sort of what realists call buck passing. So, traditionally European states have relied on American defense to be the principal umbrella, especially for Western European nations under the NATO Article 5 security umbrella. A lot of realists, from John Mearsheimer to Sumantra Mitra, will tell you that that's buck passing. Well, we don't want to pay this. We don't want to mandate the 2% GDP spending on NATO or on our own nation's self-defense forces or our own militaries. So we're going to rely on America to do it, right? That we're passing the buck along. But to me, this is really the first time that we're seeing America do that.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. And I think this is this too is a broader problem. I know we saw it with the Trump presidency, when he did obviously raise, among many of the points that he did raise, which were sort of lucid and true about NATO not pulling their weight, and him sort of being laughed at by many quarters. Ultimately, how long can the American taxpayer and the American government sort of carry the can for everyone else? And we have to quite seriously consider what comes with decline, be it economic or socio-cultural, political, whatever, and the ability of America to sort of act as this outer shell of protection for its allies. And I mean, again, I did mention this near the start of the stream. I sort of talked about or I referenced like them rearming Germany in the 50s, probably much far earlier than they had anticipated or even wanted to, where sort of, half the generals of the Bundeswehr had served under the previous, Wehrmacht of the the interwar period, shall I say. And that hasn't been quite so much, true of Japan, although they obviously do have their self-defense forces. But what will American capabilities be like in, 20 years time, 30, 50 years time, if America is a power that is waning? And I think a lot of these countries will have to reckon with not only establishing a foreign policy that serves their own interests, but how they actually physically set about defending those interests without being able to completely count on American support. I think this is just going to be an ongoing question, not just for Japan. It'll be true to some degree for South Korea. It'll be true for Australia. It'll be true for a lot of countries that sit on that sort of American geopolitical and geostrategic periphery.
Yeah, and to sort of continue on this tangent, I know we've been all sorts of places tonight, but the conversation's been good, is that I follow a lot of sort of the academic side of like international relations people, some scholars, some guys that are nominally related to these, like that know who some of us are. I mentioned Sumatra Mitra a lot, one, because he writes a lot, but two, he's also sort of a prominent sort of normie con guy in regards to writing for things like the American Conservative or American Affairs magazine, as well as the European Conservative. And he's a smart dude. I can't fault him for that. Plus he's with the Royal Historical Society in the UK. But he had been asking that question. He says, I don't see a lot of literature coming out of United States international relations scholars that just talks about, well, what does United States foreign policy look like that accepts or even accepts the presupposition of multipolarity? And I think that we're kind of beginning to see that with this potential, this moment of political convenience with an unpopular prime minister seeking to maintain sort of a stronger defense posture in the wake that its primary ally is busy focused on the other side of the world. And at the same time, you are now watching sort of the Sino-Soviet split fall apart, it's sort of coming back together in regards, but this time with the Russian Federation. While secondly, We're also witnessing that the United States, when Nancy Pelosi decided to visit Taiwan the way that it did and make this like full-throated defense of democracy and Taiwanese sovereignty, we also just threw out the Taipei Agreement of 1972 out the window. All that stuff that Nixon and Kissinger worked on about that this is a problem that the United States isn't really going to get too much involved in. I mean, there's going to be political pressures because of communism, but Kissinger more or less says like, look, this is I'm wiping my hands of sort of Pontius Pilate style, like, this is a Chinese internal affair issue. And we just threw that crap out the window. And so now that's sort of this de facto state of affairs that things are getting a little more mask off. And I think that Prime Minister Kishida sort of recognizes that eventually, by nature of their own alliances and their own reinterpretations of Article 9, that they may inevitably get pulled into something. I very much want to believe in the hashtag not happening gang, but this kind of posturing is going to indicate where some of the bigger hotspots are going to be for the remainder of this decade. And Taiwan has been one of those long-standing, issues that has been around not just since the fall of the Soviet Union, but beforehand. And it's going to continue to be an issue unless we see some serious de-escalation or some kind of detente coming out of the West and the United States specifically. But so far, the Biden administration has really kept a lot of its predecessors' policies in regards to China, especially on economics, manufacturing, and also intelligence.
Yeah, indeed. Just to sort of tack on to what we're saying, I'm just reading the comments here. Rainlord raised a good point about Pelosi. I mean, I would go so far to say that yes, I think Pelosi's trip to Taiwan and to Taipei was mostly act. It was mostly, some kind of a demonstration by the American political class. But indeed, it did also revolve around the negotiation with the TSMC and the Chip Act. Obviously, that was a part of it. But I mean, a person, I put it this way: if Taiwanese representatives had flown to the USA, I mean, that agreement still could have been knocked up. There was obviously a message sent by Pelosi jumping on a plane and going to Taipei. I mean,
it was a rather effective one too. I mean, the Chinese didn't respond in an aggressive manner, but sort of watched. And
aside from their naval maneuvers, sort of around.
They did a naval exercise, live fire exercise. I think north of Taiwan right afterwards. But I couldn't. The memes were entertaining to just say like, my favorite one was this like fake Nancy Pelosi fundraising email being like, my aircraft is being shot down right now. If I don't get like $45,000 more put into like the campaign fund, we'll never come back from this. And, but it did illustrate though that, for the time being that this is an interesting position where the United States is sort of flexing itself and relying on its allies to help bolster the cause. I mean, the war has definitely taken a substantial financial and logistical toll on the U.S. And I just think that this is a way to sort of keep, quote unquote, the allies in line as well, especially for kind of giving a gimme where you have an unpopular prime minister at home looking for a political win abroad. And I think that he'll probably secure it. The question becomes, can he deliver domestically? And I think that we'll have to revisit the subject in a month or two just to see how well things have gone. Because we always need to revisit these things. We can't just do one-offs.
But yeah, I suppose inversely as well. I mean, let's not forget that there's such a thing as like a real demonstration of authority, and one that's born out of a little bit of desperation, and one that's kind of shallow. And I suppose if I was I obviously share absolutely no political sympathy with the regime in Beijing, but if I was amongst the Chinese elite, I'd think to myself, well, I'll let this one pass. And it doesn't matter so much because ultimately, whilst Pelosi has a pen in her hand and signs this agreement with Taiwan in Taipei, well, the Americans emptying their stockpiles of M777s and Bradleys, and they're being left as shells, on the borderlands of Donbass. I mean, who's actually winning here? So, I think there's such a thing as a symbolic victory and a real victory. So I think that's also needs to be taken into account as well.
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I mean, I remember that there was an article discussing about like potentially bringing the United States has all these M60 patents that are sitting in mothballed storage that we might pull out. And I know that that's for the purposes of having NATO compatible equipment, but I was just thinking to myself, what year is this? Like, we really are getting to test out all the old Cold War toys in that respect. But
Indeed.
are there any
Indeed.
final thoughts here that you wanted to add in sort of this position as we watch sort of the Americans, embrace Kushida in this more, I don't want to say adventurous positioning, but he definitely wants to bolster its political stance with regards to its military.
I don't really have so much to add, perhaps in that context. But what I will say is that looking from a sort of a realistic perspective and one that adheres to these ideas, or perhaps the realization that yes, it's evident that in one way or another, and I know you yourself are an American. We have many American friends. So I sort of don't say this lightly. I say this as a person whose country is somewhat dependent on America's ability to project power and to sort of maintain its hegemonic peripheral strength against other powers. Is that we just sort of have to keep in mind that nations and empires do wax and wane, and I touched on the thing about it, symbolic victories versus real victories, because I think that much is true, and we have to reckon with the fact that yes, for all their faults and for their internal frailties, China is a country that is rapidly growing in strength economically, militarily, etc. And although China is a country which is sort of bereft of the resources it needs to maximize that potential, it is still powerful nonetheless. Meanwhile, I think with America, we're sort of seeing this case of where, and I know sort of comparisons with Rome will make people roll their eyes, and rightly so in most cases, but a bit like, say, in the later stages of certainly the western half of the empires, you have this sort of this stiff shell where there's a residual strength that is there, but it's sort of internally there is not this robustness that once existed. The USA that fought the two world wars and arguably fought Vietnam is not the United States of America of today. It's a very, very different country. And what is that capacity of that nation to not only to exert its power externally, but how long can it keep its own house sorted? I mean, I know like put this way, without making specific references, if we consider some of the demonstrations and some of the ongoings within America since say 2016, 17 onwards, right? Could one have imagined that in the the Reagan era, or the actual Fresh Prince era? Probably not. So there's internal disturbances too, which will have ramifications out in the world, and this, by extension, affects American allies. It affects the NATO countries. This affects Germany. It affects the Germans' attitude towards their own army in the context of the Bundeswehr. It affects the French. It affects the British. It thus likewise affects the South Koreans and the Japanese. And there will come a time, probably in the relatively near future, certainly over the next couple of decades, whereby countries will have to perhaps question the reliability of American help in a worst case scenario, and will have to tend to their own means for defense and indeed sustaining their own power projections. Say, for example, you had that map up of Japan and its proximity to to China and the islands that sort of tail towards past Okinawa and towards Taiwan. Japan will have to have the means to be able to hold its own, and that's up to the Japanese government and people whether they do that or not.
Yeah, and I think that is going to be something. Coincidentally, I think the question you pose about sort of the value or the value of an American promise, or how much American military assistance you can rely on. I think we're going to get into that question very soon. I think that we're seeing that sort of happen right now over Ukraine with regards to what kind of expenditures and equipment that they're willing to send over. I think you're seeing that rather right now with the Leopard 2 situation, with Germany not wanting to really give them, sort of calling the Americans on it, that, listen, we won't give any away unless they decide to send Abrams tanks over there. And the Americans had kind of pushed back, saying, well, the Abrams tank takes a while to train with and things like that. But
and plus the other thing as well, I mean, we've seen this. I mean, a study of the Eastern Front of the Second World War can actually teach a person a lot about the realities of war in a geography that is quite extensively different. Fighting in northern periphery of Estonia is very different than the Crimea, for instance. Like it's the same front, but they're two quite different climatic zones, if you get my meaning. And and the difficulties that the Germans had, whereby they would have to literally set fires under their German Panzers in the mornings to dethaw the engine so they could start them. Whereas the Russian tanks, because the Russians are used to their own climate, design things in a way that their vehicles will operate certainly with more efficiency in their native climate and in their native geography. I mean, this is true of, say, like the Russian tank, the T-70, T-90, the Russian armored personnel carriers, etc. They are obviously designed with their own geography in mind and the areas in which surround Russia. Whereas, I mean, the Leopard 2 obviously can and does work in those areas, perhaps maybe slightly less effectively. But the Abrams is certainly a different beast. And being a turbine-powered tank, it's a very different thing. And the other thing is, too, is we have to take into account, and I don't want to tangent because I know this is about Japan, but, a military vehicle is only as skilled as its crew. And I think we're probably going to see now, with the fact that Ukraine has suffered a year's worth of attrition, is a similar thing that we're going to see in the Panzerwaffe of post 1944. Is that, yes, these fantastically powerful vehicles come to the fore, but without experienced and well-trained crews, their combat effectiveness will be reduced. And I think the West can send all these Leopard 2s and all these Abrams, theoretically speaking, to Ukraine, but if they don't have the crews for them or the sufficient training or indeed support vehicles, and you got to think, tanks work synergistically with with indirect fire, with artillery, and with air cover and all these sorts of things, then the vehicles themselves are of much less value. And I think again, it's that whole, what's a real victory and what's a symbolic victory. And I think, even say, for example, with the Bradley thing, it's like, it's an ability for the regime to say, yes, we're doing this, not that it's actually going to have a real tangible positive outcome for Ukraine, as an example.
Well, yeah, no, and to let the viewers know, and those who are on Substack, for me, I am going to be writing the buck passing question in more detail these coming weeks, so keep an eye out for that. But everything that you just discussed there, Charlemagne, Furious, Charlemagne, myself, and Semigog and Martin Sellner are going to talk about on Thursday. So we'll talk about that stuff rather clearly with regards to Poland.
Yeah, but, indeed. And just to say as well, because I do have a draft up. I haven't actually got there yet, but I am writing a draft. I've been sort of talked into potentially doing Substacks. I actually don't have anything for myself aside from my Twitter, so I am considering a Substack. And on that issue of the crews, because I actually just finished a book about like German armored operations in World War II. I'm actually thinking of doing that comparison or writing about that subject. So keep that in mind. If I do get my Substack out in a couple of weeks, it'll be on that subject.
Well, fantastic. Well, with that, I think we're going to wrap up this discussion for this evening. I will revisit in the future. I do know that I have one patron who is out of Japan, who I will be DMing more for more sort of internal details and how things feel over there with regards to the Prime Minister and more. I have a feeling that this is not going to be what this may feel like, a political gamble and a move to get American support for his own domestic affairs for getting this policy in place. I don't think that it bears repeating, but we will be returning to the subject in the near future. But we're going to get now to announcements, Frog of the Week, and then Super Chats. So there is the Entropy linked pinned there if you don't want to give Susan any of your money, which I wholeheartedly encourage not giving Google your money, despite taking advantage of their platform. You don't have to give them any cash. So I'm going to go share my screen, and we will get started with announcements and things like that. And, of course, promotion and catching up with you wonderful people. So share system audio. And then we'll go to slideshow, if it'll load. Fantastic, it loaded this time. All right, so for announcements, like I mentioned just earlier now, myself, Martin Sellner, Semiagog, and Charlemagne will all be on Semiagog's channel this Thursday, the 26th, at noon Eastern, to discuss the ongoing discussion we've had on Intramarium, the 3Cs initiative, and sort of the financial and political interests that are pushing this proposed policy, as well as Polish military investment and support from the United States in regards to the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and what that means. So everything we were just talking about with the Leopard 2, as well as Poland's push to send Leopard tanks into Ukraine, that that stuff will all be discussed this Thursday on Semiagog's channel. This coming Friday, the 27th of February, I will be recording an interview with Benjamin Boyce. He's sort of been interviewing some of our friends on the right. He had a discussion with the Distributist. He had one with Charlemagne not too long ago. And we had scheduled something. So that this coming Friday on the 27th, he and I will have an interesting discussion. For those of you who don't know who he is, he's got his own, he interviews a variety of people, and he was sort of there to record the Evergreen College stuff, but he's got a large audience, and I'm certainly thankful for the opportunity. But that next day, the 28th of Saturday, Patron Book Club. So if you are a supporter on Subscribestar, you will see the pinned comment Subscribestar page is talking about that. It has access to a PDF copy for free of Oswald Spengler's Man and Technics. That's what we will be reviewing. All of that will be recorded with my patrons. So in case you can't miss it, in case you're not available that day, do not worry. It will be recorded and accessible to you. And if you are a patron on Subscribestar, you also have access to the patron-only Discord server. That's the only reason why I have Discord, is to support the patrons and maintain updates in a quicker form of communication. I also pulled a double shift today. So prior to going live with you guys, I recorded an episode with a podcast, These People Are Sick, which used to be what the Fed Post used to be, but now it's just Slav and COH that run the show now. And we sort of talked about nostalgia, AI art, and sort of spiritual matters as well. An interesting sort of Christian conversation as well, which kind of threw me off, but it was really, really good talk. And that's already available. Please check the community tab. It was a fun conversation. This week's episode of the Digital Archipelago will be on my channel. We haven't decided yet what we're going to talk about. We've got a few issues to review, but it may be a short story / literature review episode. We want to review some of the fiction and literary work that our friends have written, from Dan Baltic to essays that we've seen from, various Substacks and things like that. So it'll be a good time. And then there will be a new video of Real Talk, the first one of 2023, out on February 1st. You can go over to the video section and make sure that you set your alarm bells and ring from there. And of course, as always, subscribe to the Old Glory Club, because the support that comes out of that leads to future support for basket weaving, meeting with people IRL, hosting events, and supporting people who've been doxxed or affected through natural disasters. We want to bring back the tradition of the American Mutual Aid Society. So those are the announcements, and let's go on to Frog of the Week, because I think it's certainly been a little too long, hasn't it? All right, so this week's Frog of the Week is Lao's leaf litter toads. They're also known as the Fujian Asian toad, endemic to the Fujian region of China. We've got this cute little guy here on the right. Like most neotropical frogs, they do rely on warmer wetland climates for spring mating season, but their stronger hind legs are helping them to be a rather well-known lowland ground burrowing frog, although you will see them climb high in the night onto trees. That's why they have those lovely little curled sticky pads on their front toes in order to help them climb through steep environments, and also rather adhesive. As a defense mechanism, they can also puff out and secrete a rather noxious and mucus-like substance that can cause intense skin irritation for human beings. So if you see one and it frightens you and your hands get sticky, be sure to quickly wash that off as soon as possible. But also, the interesting things about these little frogs, or these toads, I should say, but all toads are frogs, not all frogs are toads, is that they have an interesting mating style. And I can't believe I'm going to discuss amphibian mating strategies on here, but here we go. So yeah, Lao's leaf litter toads, according to a University of Hong Kong study in 2021, is that usually, because of how amphibians mate and their fertilization of eggs is typically external, the male is on top. This is why amphibious species are also sexually dimorphic. The males are always smaller than the females by a significant degree of magnitude, but the females are on top this time. So I guess these toads get to enjoy it in sort of a cowgirl style. But in that regard, they actually mount each in regards to their reproductive organs horizontally. So unlike traditional amphibious reproduction, they get to do things just a little bit differently. But that is louse, leaf litter toads, another wonderful amphibian to add on to my growing spreadsheet of frog of the weeks, so we don't repeat any future ones. But with that, I want to catch up with all of my wonderful people in super chats as well. But I do want to thank my top tier patrons who donate $20 or more a month on Subscribestar, which includes Fearless Leader, Raging Mandrill User 4A, 5B, 5DB5, Cowering Bugman, Winston Fujimori, Preservatism Focron, Consumer, Hunger, and Voluble Ox. You guys are some of the best, and your feedback and your suggestions have always been helpful. There's always other ways to help and get access to great things, such as channel memberships, merchandise down below, or buy me a coffee if you don't want to deal with giving Susan money, or if you don't like Subscribestar, although I've never had any issue supporting friends like Semiagog or Skeptical Waves on it as well. But I'm going to start with the Entropy Super Chats, because I don't think I saw any in regards to YouTube Studio, which is perfectly fine, because no one wants to give Google money, and it's perfectly good with me. But to get to Entropy, if it'll load this time, we've got quite a few from Ben White. So one of my favorite people, actually, from the Distributists live streams. He always sends in a dating update to Dave on Tuesday. So for some reason, I find that to be an odd parasocial thing that I just kind of enjoy, because I think it's a part of community building, I guess, for some people. But Ben White for $3. He asks, what does a rearmed Japan mean for Korea? Throughout its history, Korea has always lived under the shadow of its two greater Asian neighbors. Oh, well, that's a good question, because this is sort of, I do know that, what's that? I'm trying to remember his name. I know it's Yoon. I just don't know his last name. But the South Korean president had actually been supportive of Japan's defense posture. So from Nike Asia. So this is from an article from earlier. It said that South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol urged close security cooperation between his country and Japan in response to the nuclear threat from Pyongyang when they met Thursday with top Japanese lawmaker to discuss Tokyo's planned defense buildup. So Natsuo Yamaguchi, who leads Japan's ruling coalition member, it's told Yoon in his visit to Seoul about Japan's plan to expand its defense spending to 2% of its gross domestic product to acquire counter-strike capability to hit missile bases that pose a threat. South Korea has historically been very wary of Japan strengthening its armed forces, but facing the common threat of a nuclear-armed North Korea has put the focus on cooperation. Bilateral relations have been strained in recent years by disagreement over compensation for Korean wartime laborers, the whole comfort women controversy. But Yoon said he wanted the two countries to resolve outstanding issues as soon as possible in the name of bilateral security. So I guess despite some of the longstanding historical, racial, and political issues with regards to the Pacific War, that there seems to be a relatively okay position here. Whether how much that may mean with South Korea's own domestic politics and what that may mean with regards to their own position against the American having the military bases in South Korea, who knows? I will have to do more research into that, and I think that warrants a future discussion on prudent observations, but so far it seems that they're not too opposed to it.
Indeed, and I think it's sort of that cleaves just to that last point before we got. I digress a little bit on Ukraine there, about people who or countries that exist on the periphery of the USA and its alliance and its sort of strategic circle, whereby these countries will have to reckon at some point in time with the potentiality of America being either unwilling or simply incapable of being able to intervene, and what are their options in the face of that, and what capacity do they themselves possess. And for instance, even though South Korea and Japan will obviously have their cultural differences, obviously have historical, enmity going back in time, well, as so far as the South Korean government in Seoul is concerned, and that of the Japanese government in Tokyo, given their immediate geopolitical and strategic conundrum, if I can put it that way, they are each other's sort of best friends that they have, because everybody else is either neutral or sort of hostile in their immediate vicinity. So that would be natural for them to have that disposition.
Well, he continues on. Ben White for $3 US. Regarding Taiwan, I don't think China will make any military moves anytime soon. However, this will leave me more time to visit Taiwan and try my luck with the ladies. They'll swoon over my USD. Hashtag dollar king. Well, I do wish you the best of luck in that regard, Ben White, if you're going to go over there and do that. Nothing like good old Western buying a wife, I guess, in regards to the US dollar. But you do you, man.
Just hope he doesn't end up like the American Lord Miles, where it's just like, oh yeah, I'm in Kabul, and oh, the Taliban have just entered the city, and help,
Yeah, heaven forbid Ben White super chatting the distributor saying, "Hey, I think I found someone, Dave. The Chinese, the People's Republic Liberation Forces are on the beachhead. What do I do?"
He tweets like, "Oh, is this a Chinese major general? Like, help."
Ben White can be the lost in translation for when China inevitably. Yes. I don't think China will either. I think, as we talked about earlier, the specific issue with regards to they didn't really respond in any way, shape, or form when Nancy Pelosi did it. Like there was no real strong aggression. So,
I saw it in the chat. Someone said that whole Soviet trope about China's final warning, in inverted commas, it's the same old age-old trope that describes it well.
Yeah. Ben White, again, for US $3. He says, does Japan have any soft power that they can exert with their immigrant communities in the US? I know that China has been expanding their influence through their expats in some Southeast Asian and Western countries. Not to the degree that China has in any way, shape, or form. Like, there's not Japanese police forces, having operation stations in places like Montreal or New York City. But, I guess the way that you might want to do it would be through the power of anime. But even then, their soft culture, they have an impressive lobby by nature of just defense. And not to mention that America prioritizes them in a way with its own Asiatic strategy. But not that I'm aware of to the degree that China does. But I'm sure that I don't think that they need that sort of soft power leverage in the same way that, say, other countries do to levy their immigrant communities. Plus, the Chinese immigrant community in the United States is just an order of magnitude larger than the Japanese one, at least in its political influence, I should say, with regards to its lobbying and cultural practices. That it's just, I don't think it's a very comparable situation.
No, I'm inclined to agree.
Yeah. Rain Lord for $3 Canadian. This has sort of been the gentleman who's been DMing me a lot with sort of Chinese info and things like that, just his time there. Japan lacks a proper defensive industry. China launches 2 times the tonnage of warships that the U.S. does each year. China will enjoy having Japan as Asia's Ukraine. The mainland will only attack Taiwan if the USA is on the table. Be interesting. I don't know if I feel like if attacking Japan or turning Japan into sort of the Chinese as Asia's Ukraine, that'd be the quickest way to get the USA being involved there. But mainland will only attack Taiwan if USA is on the table. Well, that certainly tends to be the case. But it seems so far that the Chinese are willing to wait it out in that regard. In terms of increasing their production, in terms of naval tonnage, investing in intelligence, and continuously sort of taking advantage of the American education system in regards to both Confucius centers and espionage, and recruiting American professors to be spies for the Chinese. And they do it in an interesting way, because they'll recruit, they'll usually recruit white sort of liberal professors in technical fields, and they won't use individuals that look like them, at least in regards to Asiatic appearance, which sort of, it's an interesting mechanism, I think, of sort of throwing off to not spy on the usual subjects with the Americans. But it would be interesting to see if that's the case. Plus, if mainland Japan or Japan is the one that gets attacked, the U.S. uses the ultimate strategic tripwire to get involved. But I guess that would come at a point in time where, in the future, perhaps the United States cannot act as quickly, or has its chain of islands and such to rely on logistics and getting troops and supplies over there to be cut off. It's an interesting scenario to think about. It requires, I'm sure it's been war gamed out somewhere. I'm sure there's a court paper that has this rather detailed out.
Indeed, and it'll depend on what the quality and disposition of US forces are at that time, if it were to happen. like I said before, that could all change an awful lot in the next 15, 20, 25 years. I mean, we can't quantify what's in the future. It's just that.
Yeah. And then let me refresh real quick in regards to studio. I think we got one on YouTube, but comes from, let's see here. Oh, no, it's just here via Entropy. Okay. So Cringe Walker for $5 US. And he says, so Furious, would Weeb Australia have been based or cringe in an alternate World War II universe? This one's for you, buddy.
Weeb Australia, as in what they would have joined the Japanese. Is that how I'm meant to interpret it?
I guess he'll have to answer it. And I would here. We'll just play it out in two ways. One, either Japan is wins and Australia is sort of under Japanese influence, or they side with Japanese. So you have two scenarios to play with there.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. I just can't envision that, just because Australia is very much, and I've sort of referenced this before. I sort of consider Australia to be Britain's greatest sort of Commonwealth exemplar of like Britannia and Absentia. But needless to say, yeah, it would be interesting to sort of see Australia or New Zealand as sort of like this outer periphery of Japan's, what is it, the greater Asian co-prosperity sphere. But yeah, I suppose it's a bit like entertaining a bit of a Man in the High Castle scenario of what would that hegemony look like in the context of an alternative World War II outcome. And I just find Weeb Australia a difficult thing to actually imagine. I can't exactly picture Crocodile Dundee speaking Japanese. It does jar my psychology just a little too much. But yeah, who's to know?
And then last but not least, we have Prince of Parma, who's been doing this to both myself and Jay Burden for a while, and I kind of have to chuckle at it. Prince of Parma sends 14 South African Rand, which just translates to 75 cents, and he says 75 cents for based diplomats. So thank you, Prince of Parma. I greatly appreciate it.
Thank you very much, friend. We very much appreciate the super chat.
It means so much from the bottom of my heart. Although I have to laugh because I chat rather regularly with Conscious Caracol and Svan Ziel in South Africa, and we'll talk about.
I do love Caracol.
I love him. He's a great man, and it blows my mind that he and I are the same age, and it's just like he's got all this. Talk about geographic privilege, just like this is all the shit he has to deal with, and he's the 27-year-old man in Australia, in South Africa, and here in the United States, it's just like, well, I don't have it nearly as bad as he does, but it's like looking into the future. But he'll tell me whatever he's reading in his books, and he's like, oh yeah, I picked something up for like 14 or 15 Rand or 30 Rand or 50 Rand. And then I'm like doing the math in my head, or I'll look up the conversion rate. And I'm like, it's damn, like buying books is easy buying books is easy in South Africa. He always loves it because you never know what ends up there.
Well, I was going to say that one of the very, very few perks of having, like your entire educational university system just like dilapidated by corrupt government, actual worthwhile books tend to enter circulation and will be very cheap because no one's actually utilizing them. So call it a rare South African perk.
The silver lining of South Africa.
Well, that's right, and the thing is too, because I mean, I'm sure we've discussed this in our circles. A lot of men who were, or people actually who either were born and raised in Rhodesia or indeed South Africa, have come to Australia just because simply our cultures are. And Caracal actually said this, I think, the last time he streamed, because I did watch it, and he sort of mentioned that, I mean, as an Afrikaner, if you go sort of somewhere else, you sort of, especially if you marry a non-Afrikaner, you sort of become, or your children will obviously not be Afrikaner, they'll be something else. But in fact, a lot of them have in fact come to Australia, and because there's a relatively large contingent of them here, a degree of sort of descendant Afrikaner culture has continued in Australia, and I'm actually heartened by that because all my interactions with them have been very good, and they sadly found themselves in a dire situation back home, and for at least them, coming to a country like Australia, the differential between our countries isn't too great, and even topographically and climatically we're similar. So I'm actually I'm glad that I know many Afrikaners myself, and I would consider them good people and good friends. So.
Yeah, I know.
And our friends in our sphere are no exception to that.
Oh, absolutely. I was about to say, I've been very blessed to call Conscious Caracol a friend and to regularly chat with him has been an absolute blessing just to hear a differing perspective, from a man my age as well. Just it's been a blessing. And I need to pay an exorbitant amount of shipping because I owe him quite a few books that I wanted to send him over. I found a very interesting copy of the history of South Africa, and I think it's from like 1649 to 1875 that I wanted to send to him. And then he's never read Carlyle at all. And so I had a double copy from not this most recent Christmas, but the last Christmas. I had two copies of, the heroic in history that I'm going to send to him. So I've said it on air, so I have to remind myself. I have to force myself to go do it and send it off to him because I do owe him those texts. But yeah, I can't wait to hear his perspective on Carlyle when he eventually gets around to it.
Yeah, very good, my friend. Oh, very good.
Well, with that being said, and I think that's it for the super chats.
We got a last comment here. Oh man, I'm late, man. Just as we finished the stream.
Oh no, it happens. Don't worry. These things. I don't put things. I don't put the show behind a paywall, so it will be waiting for you.
Yes.
As the VOD, and you're in the VOD now, so don't worry. Even if you made it late, you can catch it all from the beginning. And because I have that lovely 3-minute little intro for everyone to sort of come in, just go to the 3-minute mark and we'll get started. But Mr.
Speaking of that intro, I still love that little AOE frog intro thing. It's just a wave of nostalgia. Like it's like guys our age, instead of like Fresh Prince, it's like go back to AOE 1. Like it's
return to 90s isometric RPGs and RTSs.
2D sprites, yeah.
Return to Sprite.
Yes.
I remember playing Cossacks as a kid. That was a good time. Should probably try and incorporate that, but I have to thank our friend Cyberpunk Internal Affairs because he has done the theme music for myself, Semiagog, Apostolic Majesty, and I think he's worked on a few others as well.
And it's all wonderful stuff.
Yeah, all wonderful. He's a very talented musician, very good at mixing sound. But Mr. Furious, I know that you had just sort of teased out the possibility of a Substack, but where can we find you, and what is the Pasta Posse up to these days?
Well, our dear friend Mr. Majesty is taking a well-deserved break because for those who do follow I'll say our channel, but his channel, we are myself and Columba merely guests on Apostolic Majesty. He's taking a well-deserved break because he has put out an awful lot of content in the last 18 months, as we all know, and it involves a lot of reading and drafts and collating information because he's a very modest man. He's sort of say, oh, I don't know much about this, and then he has this vast collection of sources and excerpts and quotes, and our streams are rarely sort of under 2.5 or 3 hours, so he's having a well-deserved rest, which is good. So in the meanwhile, I'm kind of I myself am sort of semi-unemployed on YouTube at the moment. I existed the generosity of people like yourself and Semigog and academic agents. So I'll bounce around from channel to channel in the meantime, which is always good fun. Obviously follow me on Twitter if you fancy following my shenanigans and my med posting. But indeed, yes, I have a couple of drafts lined up. And I don't know what the exact time scale is because I'm actually more settled in one location now because my last year has been very much me darting between 2 or 3 localities IRL. So I've not really been settled. But now that I have most of my books in one location, I have a bit of a draft going where I'm going to talk about obviously in the last few months, we sort of saw Russia withdraw from places like Kherson and Kharkov region in the face of Ukrainian counterattacks, and I was just going to talk about tactical withdrawals in the context of the Eastern Front in World War II and making contemporaneous comparisons to the present conflict. And as we just touched on now about the cruise, and I was going to touch on the Panzerwaffe because if anyone who's interested in subjects of war, reading about the panzers in Normandy is an interesting affair, and then sort of the degradation of the Panzerwaffe thereafter. So if that's your thing, you should read about it. And those are the 2 things I'm drafting at the moment. So hopefully in the not too distant future, I will have a Substack and I will have those writings up.
Well, good to know. As I said, you can find him at Furius underscore Pertinax. No, it's just all one word. Furius
It's
Pertinax
all
on
one word.
Twitter.
I'm an illiterate Australian, so I don't do underscores and stuff. So.
And if you'd like to see your lovely name called out every Saturday or Sunday, depending on the availability of my guests, by all means, the subscribe star link is down below. Your ongoing support means the world to me. And of course, there are so many options, including a Frog of the Week mug. I will be putting out new merchandise soon. And as the announcements go, by all means, it's going to be a very busy week content-wise for me with regards to Substacks. I think I'm going to be live with Oren McIntyre either this Monday or Tuesday. And it's going to be a difficult time because the way he invited me, asking me to want to come on, it was like, hey, Prue, do you want to not try and Fed post on this particular topic? And I was like, we're going to give it a shot. So it'll be a good time. It'll be a very busy week this week content-wise. And there's already stuff for you to listen to already. So by all means, check the community tab and give those guys a follow. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you all have a pleasant beginning to the start of your week. And as we end all episodes of Prudent Observations now, it'll be from a little bit of scripture. So today's reading is going to come from the Wisdom of Sirach, also known as Ecclesiastes, if you have a Roman Catholic Bible. And we're going to start with 4:24, and we'll end a little bit later on. So, starting off. For wisdom is made known by a word, and instruction by a word of the tongue. Do not speak against the truth, and do not be put to shame by your ignorance. And do not be ashamed to confess your sins, and do not exercise force against the current of a river. Do not subject yourself to a foolish man, and do not show partiality to a ruler. Fight to the death for the truth, and the Lord God will fight for you. Do not be rash with your tongue, and sluggish and neglectful in your works. Do not be like a lion in your home, and act in pretense with your servants, and do not let the hand be extended to receive, and shut when you should repay. And that is from the Wisdom of Sirach 4:24 to 4:31. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you all have a very pleasant beginning to your week. I hope if you're listening on the VOD that your Monday is going well. I know quite a few of you listen to these while you're working out. And one of the ongoing projects starting in February will be a return to Prudent Reads. We're going to start doing book reviews again. But also I'm going to move all of this content to audio platforms as well. So you can listen to them on Spotify, Podbean, and Anchor, and things like that. That has been my ongoing missions to get a complete audio record and beginning to organize things in playlists and things like that. And that's what we're going to work on in the near future. So with that, wonderful ladies and gentlemen, I bid you all a fond good evening, good morning, and good afternoon, wherever you are. Take care, and we'll see you all next time. Cheers, everyone.
Take care and God bless.